Hey developers! Today we're going to be building a chatbot for the Snapdragon X Elite that runs at the edge. This chatbot will leverage the NPU and be written in Python using AnythingLLM as the backend language model server. Let's get started. Today I'm going to take you through the process of building a chatbot for the Snapdragon X Elite. This application is going to be written in Python using AnythingLLM as the language model server. Before we start, I want to show you the hardware that I'm using so you can make sure you're using something similar. I'll be writing this on a Dell Latitude 7455 that has the Snapdragon X Elite in it. My machine has 32 gigabytes of memory and is running Windows 11. If you have something similar, you should be fine, but I would recommend having at least 16 gigabytes of memory to get the performance that you might expect. The first thing we'll need is AnythingLLM. You can go to anythingllm.com to download the application. It's totally free, and it has an open source license. There's tons of features built into it, and I love this about it because it really makes it easy to develop language model applications when you don't have to think about all the other components that you might want to tie in. To download AnythingLLM, you can click the Download for Desktop button and make sure you grab this version. This version has access to the NPU, and the x64 version does not. So if you want that acceleration, make sure you get the right one. I already have it downloaded, so I'm not going to download it again. Once you have AnythingLLM, there's a couple things you need to do to set up the application, which we'll do first so that we can stick with the coding once we get there. The first time opening the application, it's going to look a little bit different than what you see on my screen right now. You'll be prompted to set up a couple things, such as a workspace, a language model provider, and a model. I'm going to take you through that process as if it's already been set up so that you know where to find those, but they'll be the same settings as you're going through the initial setup process. One of the things they'll prompt you to do is to make a workspace. You can name your workspace anything, but for simplicity, I would recommend naming it a single string of characters that are all lowercase, because it makes it easier to reference the workspace later on in the project. For this one, I'll be using the workspace titled Recording. To create a new workspace, you'll just click New Workspace if you haven't already created one, or in the initial setup, you'll be prompted to create one automatically. To access the LLM provider settings and model settings, you can open the Settings tab, drop down the AI Providers link, and click on LLM. By default, on a Snapdragon X Elite, if you've downloaded the correct version of AnythingLLM, you should see Qualcomm QNN as the language model provider. Underneath, you have two options of models you can use, Llama 3.1 and Llama 3.2. You can pick whichever you want, but for this one, I'm going to be picking Llama 3.2 because it's a bit smaller. The last thing you'll need to do is get your Developer API token. You can find that under the Tools tab in the sidebar and click Developer API. This API key is private to your device, so there's no problem with sharing it on screen here. This is to make sure that other devices on the local network that might have access to AnythingLLM have proper permissions to access it. To get your API key, you'll have to generate a new API key, and then you can copy it with this Copy API Key button. Now that we have all that set up in AnythingLLM, we're going to go into our code and do a couple other setup steps so that we can get started with the coding. First thing I'm going to do is grab this config file that I've pre-written, and we're going to copy it into the root of our repository. You can see on the first line I have the API key that I copied recently. I have the model server base URL. This is set in AnythingLLM. I have a workspace slug, which is named what I named my workspace. I also have two additional settings about streaming, because this chatbot is going to stream the responses live as it's getting the tokens from the server. One other thing I would like to show you in AnythingLLM is the Developer API. If you go back to the Developer API key, you see a little link to the API documentation here. This is where I found the API endpoints that I needed to hit, and there's a ton that I'm not even going to cover in this video, so I would encourage you to go and explore to see what's available with AnythingLLM. Once you have your config.yaml file set up, you can close it because we shouldn't need to come back to it later. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a requirements file that I have pre-saved into the root of my folder as well. This is available on the GitHub repository that's linked in this video, so you can go grab it from there if you want. You'll notice that there's a bunch of requirements that are listed in this file, and it's because the full version of this application includes a streaming and blocking chat, so that you have flexibility to choose whichever you prefer. In the video, we'll be sticking with streaming, so we're not going to look at the blocking portion, but I left the requirements so that they look familiar to you when you go to the full repository. One last bit of setup I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the skeleton code that I've already pulled from my repository and move it into what's going to be our source file for the chatbot. You can see here we have a class chatbot with a couple functions that will be used to handle the messages as you're typing to your chatbot. The one I want to call out is the streaming chat async handler, because that is what enables the streaming. If you prefer to use a blocking chat, you wouldn't need this. You could just write all of your chat logic in a chat function that is called when you call run. Now that we have all this, I'm going to set up a virtual environment and install my requirements so that I can make sure I have everything I need in my environment. So I'll open my terminal. To set up your virtual environment, you first need to install it with Python. So we'll call python-m venv, and we'll name it chatbot venv. This should take just a moment to set up, and because we're on a Windows machine, it will automatically set up all the scripts for Windows. And there we go. If we do ls, we can see here we have our chatbot venv. Next thing I'm going to do is activate the virtual environment. So on a Windows machines, you would do it as follows. /chatbot-venv, scripts, and activate. Very similar to a Linux device. Now that we have our virtual environment activated, you'll install the requirements. So you can do that with pip install -r requirements.txt. It'll take a second to install all the requirements if you don't have them installed already. For this project, we'll be using Python 3.12. If you go to the repository, that information is listed here, along with the information about the AnythingLLM provider and the chat model we're using. There we go. Oh, looks like I'm being prompted to install a new version of pip, but I'm going to skip that here because it's not necessary. Now that we have our virtual environment set up, it's time to get to the code. The first one I'm going to start with is the initialization function, because that's the most important. First thing we're going to do is load our YAML configuration. And then we'll set up a couple of the variables for the chatbot. To load the YAML configuration, we'll do with open, and we'll call our YAML file, which is config.yaml, and we'll open it in reading mode. And we'll do config equals yaml.safeload, and then f, our file. So that'll load everything in from the YAML file that you've written. And if you have an additional parameter that you add for whatever reason in your project, you'll also load it in here as well. We're also going to pull in all of the different configuration keys in our YAML file so that we can use them in the chatbot. For simplicity, I've named them the same in the YAML file, so it is a little bit repetitive to pull them in, but I figure it makes it easier for you as a developer to understand what's going on. The stream timeout configuration variable is controlling how long the stream stays open as it's generating a response. You can play with this if you prefer to have shorter streams, but the chatbot may still be generating an output if you have a shorter stream time, and it might get cut off unintentionally. The workspace parameter can be used to select the workspace you're using in AnythingLLM. Each workspace can contain its own selection of documents, so you can separate them by domain if you prefer. I'm not going to be digging into the workspace here, so I'm just using the one I set up. But if you prefer to split workspaces by the content that you have in each of them, feel free to do so. It's going to give you a lot more power and control over what your chatbot is responding. The reason I recommended earlier in the video to use a simple workspace slug with lowercase characters is because the workspace slug might get changed depending on what your workspace is called and may not match. So if you keep it as a lowercase string, it will always match, and it will make it easier for you to find it when you're setting up your API. The last two things we need are the chat URL, which I'll fill in one moment, as well as the headers. The headers are sent every time you make a request to the AnythingLLM API, so it's helpful to set them here, and then you can go back. The chat URL is going to be a combination of some of the pieces that we've defined just above. This is to make it easier for you to include other endpoints as you build out this application in the future. The base of it is going to be, of course, the base URL, so we'll call self.base URL. Then it will be /workspaces. Then you'll have the option to choose the particular workspace you're using. In this case, it's going to be recording from my config file, but I have that referenced in the self.workspace variable. And then because we're doing streaming, my endpoint is going to be stream.chat. If you chose instead to do a blocking chat, where all of the text will load before it outputs the response, you would do just chat instead. For the headers, we have 3 headers that I want to add in. First one is going to be accept. Then we're going to set the content type that we're sending, which in this case is also application/JSON. The last header we need to add in is the authorization token. This was defined in the config.yaml file, so you can pull it from just above. Authorization, and it's going to be bearer space plus self.api key. With that, you should have everything you need to make the request to the AnythingLLM language model server as you're making the chat requests. The next function we're going to write is the run function. This is the function that's going to accept the user input and then also handle the AnythingLLM chatbot sending you a response back. This is going to be an infinite loop, so we'll start with a while true at the top. Then we'll get the user message from input. And I'm just going to write you, but you can put anything you want here. The next thing I always like to add in is your break statement, so you're not just breaking out, and you can break out cleanly. So I'll do if user message in, let's check for the lowercase actually, in, and then here's where you can add all of your exit statements that you want. So for mine, I'm just going to do exit today. But feel free to add other things like bye if you prefer, or whatever kind of exit you'd like to check for. And if that happens, then I'm going to print out exiting chat. Goodbye. And that way we know that we finished up with the chat, and we can break out of this loop. Now that we have that out of the way, we need to make sure that we handle the response from the chatbot so the user can see what is happening. So this is going to be, first we'll print a blank line. That way we just have a little space between the user messages and then the chatbot messages. And then we'll do a try and accept block. So I'll go ahead and add those in really quickly. For the accept block, I'm just doing a general exception. So I'll do accept exception as E. But you can go ahead and make specific error catching if you prefer. And I'll do sys.exit. And we'll do f error details, and then output the messages. At least this way now, if the chatbot exits out, you know there was an error, and you can go back and figure out what's going on. For the actual message from the chatbot, we're going to be using the function just below, which is self._, streaming chat async handler. And we need to pass in the user message. The reason I've written it this way with a function that is called internally is because in order to stream properly, you need to use asynchronous code. And I want to make sure that it's easy to handle without having to overcomplicate things. So I'm using a handler here. And that's about it for the run function. So we can get into the streaming chat handler and the streaming chat functions themselves. The streaming chat handler is pretty easy because all it's doing is it's calling async.io to then call the chatbot. So I'll do async.io.run, and this is where I'll call my streaming chat. And don't forget to include the message in there as well. And I need to go up and modify my function so I have my message in there. If you prefer, you can add type definitions as well. Now we're at the last function. This is where all the magic is happening in the chatbot. First, I'm going to set up my data. So this is the body that will get passed to the chatbot. And there's a couple pieces you need to put in here so it has all the information that it needs. First thing you want to add is the message. This is being passed into the function. So make sure you add that to the function definition. The next thing you'll want to do is mode. AnythingLLM has two different modes. They're called chat or query, which I'll write both of them so you can see, chat or query. The difference between the two is that chat is the traditional chatbot where it will generate text based on what you tell it. And query will actually query documents that you may have loaded into your workspace. Because in this case we're just using a chatbot, I'm picking chat, but query is really helpful if you don't want it to return responses if there's no relevant information. The next one we need to add is called session ID. Now, this is a required parameter, but you can define it for yourself. This is meant to help you as a developer handle the different chat sessions that you're running. So in this case, I'm just going to do example session ID, and you can fill it in with whatever you prefer or leave it the same. And last but not least, we'll need one argument called attachments, and this is an empty list containing links because we're not calling anything here and attaching it to the call to the chatbot. Now that we have that, I'm going to set up one other variable before we get to the main streaming loop, which is a buffer. This is where we're going to collect the responses from the chatbot and then output them to the screen so that we can handle the asynchronous functionality. With all of that in place, we're ready to get the main loop. So I'll do the exceptions first like I did last time so that it's pretty consistent and we know what we're looking for. First one I'm going to do is a request error. Actually, the only one I'm going to do is a request error. So httpx.request error as E. And in here, we're going to print something for the user called, we'll just say request error like last time. And I'll make it an F string so we can include the error, request error. Again, feel free to go and modify this as you see fit so that it's a little bit more descriptive for your use cases. Inside our function here, we're going to open an async with to give us a little bit of context. So it's going to be async with httpx.async client. And then we'll give it a timeout of self.streamTimeout right there. So that'll time out the loop here in case we leave it open for too long. And then we'll call this as client. Next, we'll set up a stream with that client to the request endpoint. So it's going to be a post request since we're passing all the data we defined just above. And then we're going to give it self.chatURL, which is where it's going to, the endpoint it's going to hit. And then we'll pass in the headers equals self.headers. And then lastly, we'll pass in the JSON data. JSON equals data. And then we'll call this as response for easier handling when we're actually in our code. So let's take a second to look at what we've done so far before we actually get into this. We have our chatbot. We have the streaming chat handler so that we can actually run the async stream. And then we have our streaming chat function that we've defined where we have the data that we're passing into the body. We have a buffer to receive the responses. And now we've done 2 nested loops to handle the client on our end with a timeout and then make the actual request to the endpoint. Now that we have all of that, we can actually print where the agent is going to be printing out its response. So I'm calling it agent here, but again, you can feel free to change this if you prefer. And then I'm just going to add end as no character so that it's a little bit easier in our output handling. Now what we're going to do is add in an async for loop so that we can actually go through the response and process it using the buffer. So I'll do async for chunk in response dot a iter underscore text. So that's async iterate through the text. And we're going to check and see what's in the chunk. So if we see that there is a chunk, that means then we want to start processing the data. So the first thing we'll check is add the buffer to the chunk, or add the chunk to the buffer, excuse me. And then we'll check and see if we see a new line, because the way that the machine works is it sends in a new line, and then we can process a single line at a time. So while we have a new line character in our buffer, which we might have more than one, so it would continue to process here if there are more than one, we can process all of those and output them to the console. So we'll get line, comma, buffer is equal to buffer.split, and then this is where we'll split it at the new line. OK. So what we've done here is we've now broken out the line we want to actually output to the chatbot screen, and then we've saved the rest of the buffer for processing later. I'm adding in a little check here so that if line.starts with data, we can handle that differently here. Line equals line slash length of the data itself. Ooh, and that needs to be indented as well. OK. That's just to help us process the data. If we do see that there's data in there for some reason, we'll actually get rid of that from the line. Now I'm going to add a try with 2 excepts so that we can handle some errors that we might run into here. These are mostly to make sure that there's nothing unexpected happening, but I like to put them in so that, as a developer, we have a little bit of sanity. So the first one I'm going to check for is a JSON decode error. So we'll do JSON decode error like that. And all we're going to do here is a continue. And this is just so that, if for some reason it tries to decode JSON data that doesn't work, you at least know as the developer. And it can be helpful to print out JSON decode error here if you prefer. After this one, I'm also going to just capture a generic error as well so that we know if something goes wrong, we can capture it. So exception as E. And here again, I'm going to print out what the error is so we know. Error processing chunk. And then we'll print out what that particular error was. And then we'll return out of this function because we want to stop if there's an error. We don't want the chatbot to keep trying to generate a response. OK. Now that we have all that done, we can go back and add the last piece that's parsing each of the chunks from the buffer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define the parsed chunk. And that's going to be JSON.loadString, because we have a string right now. And then I'm going to look for line.strip to make sure we're removing any of the extra characters, and we're going to load in the JSON dictionary now. Now that we have the JSON dictionary, we can actually pull out the text response from it. So it uses a key called text response, and we can print that to the screen. Print parsed chunk.get to make sure we're actually getting something. And we'll do text response, which again is detailed in the AnythingLLM documentation if you want to see where that's coming from. And then we'll also have just an empty string in case we don't see text response for some reason, which hopefully we do. Then we have end is going to be an empty string, and then we'll also flush out the buffer to make sure that we don't have anything left over. And that's what's going to get us the chunk, and we print it to the screen. So now you've printed out agent, and you've printed out whatever chunk of text that we're on. The last thing we want to do here is also check for the close. What close is it signifies that the stream is done, and you've received the last message, so you need to make sure you're handling that effectively. So all I'm doing here is I'm going to do if parsed chunk.get close. And then again, we'll have false just as our default response. We want to print out that we're done. And I made a typo, so let me fix that. We want to print out that we're done here. So I print out that extra space, so we have, again, some separation between what the agent has responded and what you as the user have typed. And then we can also return from this function, if I can type it correctly. And with that, we should have everything we need for the chatbot to run it. So we'll give it a test here, and hopefully everything works. I like to do one last check to make sure everything is there. So we have all of our chatbot code running. All of our configuration is correct. You should see your own API key here and your own workspace slug. And now we can bring up the terminal. So I'll bring up the terminal on the left side here. And I'm going to bring up my task manager on the right, so you can see that it's leveraging the NPU. So let's take a look at where we are in the terminal. We see we're at the root of our project, and we see the source file with our code in it. And we also then have our virtual environment, the config file, and the requirements.txt we've already used. So in order to run the chatbot, first we'll clear the screen, and we'll call Python source/chatbot. Uh-oh, looks like we got an error. Let's see what it is. Looks like on line 51 in chatbot.py, we have an async with outside of an async function. So let's take a look at the code again really quickly. Line 51, we have this async. Ah, yes, I forgot to include async on the definition of my function. So I'll add async def there, and hopefully that should solve that problem. So we'll go back to the code. I'll clear it out one more time, and then I'll call the chatbot again. Looks like we got another error. Let's see what it is. This is the fun part of coding. So if I go here, it looks like my base URL is actually named something different. So I'm going to change this so that it matches what's in my code, and it's just going to say base URL here in my configuration. So let's close this again, and we'll give it a third try. And there we go, third time's the charm. Great. So now that we have the code running, I noticed there were a couple errors I want to go back in and fix so that your code can run correctly as well. So let me first exit out using our exit command, and we'll pull the code back up here. First one is that I typed in workspaces instead of workspace. The correct API should be workspace. Also, if we scroll down, I had put on the buffer.split some hard brackets when it should have been soft brackets. And instead of a -1, we should have a +1. Now, if we go back out, so I'll scroll to the top, we'll pull up our PowerShell and our task manager again. We can rerun the code, and we should start getting an output. So let's see what we can ask it. Hello, how are you? Can you tell me a joke? And there we go. Our agent is responding. So what was the joke it gave us? Why did the clock go to therapy? Because it was feeling a little wound up. Ha 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 ha. Great. And now you can use your chatbot. You have all the features that you want in it. And you can keep talking to it if you want. So that was hilarious. Tell me another. You can see on the right side of the screen as it's generating, it's spiking the NPU, which means it's running all of the processing on the NPU, and the CPU is remaining fairly consistent. We can even ask it to say something longer. Tell me a, I don't know, 5-paragraph story. It's probably not going to get the number of paragraphs correct, but at least we'll be able to see that it's hitting the NPU and sustaining the performance over a little bit longer time frame. Look at that. We're almost at 100% utilization. So I'll let this finish running, and then we'll go back and take a look at the code so that we can do one more overview so you know what's going on, and then you'll be able to know how you can expand it from there. Great. Our story's done. I'm not going to read it because we know that it's some interesting story generated by our chatbot. So I'll hit exit again and exit out and pull up the code one last time. So what we've done is we've built a chatbot that is streaming chat responses using the AnythingLLM backend server. The class is chatbot class, and we're instantiating it in our main loop at the bottom of the file. So chatbot equals chatbot, and we're calling chatbot run. Inside of the chatbot itself, we have a couple sections. So we have the initialization function right here, where we're loading in our YAML configuration that we defined. And then we're setting all those variables for ease of use later on. Right underneath that, we have our run function. You can see I've added a couple other end commands here just for completion, and so we know that you can use anything you want. Again, if you want to add something else, go for it, but these are the ones that I generally see in other applications. Underneath that, we have the streaming chat async handler. I've added some comments as well, so you know what each function is doing. And then below that, we have the streaming chat that is using the async handler to run the streaming asynchronously. So we have our data being defined that gets passed in the API request. We have our buffer that's capturing all of the responses. We have our try except loop that's catching a request error in case HTTPX has an error. Then we have a couple loops here that are handling the stream. So the first outer loop is the client for us for our async handling. The second one is the stream post request. And the third one inside is handling chunks inside the buffer if there are multiple lines that we can print out at a time. It's looking in here for an end line, and it's processing each line one at a time to output it to the console. And that's all happening here in the parsed chunk. With that, now you have a whole chatbot that you can use, and you can expand on top of it. A couple things I'd recommend trying out are going into AnythingLLM inside your workspace and uploading some documents to it. So if I click this, you can see I have no documents in my workspace. But if you add documents, then you can start adding context to the chatbot and talking about the documents. And if you remember, I mentioned before that there was a query mode. You can also change it from chat mode to query mode and allow it to only query the documents and not return responses if there's no relevant content. I want to leave you guys with a GitHub link so that you can go through this project at your own pace in case you didn't code along with me here today. If you go to my GitHub, @thatrandomFrenchDude, and you find simple NPU chatbot, you'll have all the code as I wrote it, along with instructions for how it runs. And there's a template as well if you want to get started from scratch. At the bottom of the file, there's a couple troubleshooting instructions in case you have an issue. The two most common issues that we see are that the QNN runtime is missing because the wrong version of AnythingLLM was downloaded. And the other one is that the model is not downloaded. This is a bug that sometimes happens, and all you need to do is flip between the models and save it, and it will start downloading the model. To quickly see what that looks like, let's go to the settings in AnythingLLM. You'll see something like this, but instead of uninstall, you'll see model requires download. To solve the issue, just click on the other one, hit save, and then click on the model you want and hit save. That should resolve the issue for you. Last but not least, I really want to encourage anyone who's interested to please feel free to submit pull requests to this repository. As we continue to explore AnythingLLM, I'm going to continue adding features to this, and I want to make it as useful as possible as a base app for you to develop from. Anything you develop, send it my way so I can take a look, and I'll be happy to highlight it if I can. With that, thanks a lot for watching. Really appreciate your time today, and we'll see you for the next build along.